right, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I am the president of Network 2020. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time, Network 2020, we are an inclusive international community, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. We work through educational programs like these. We also run our own research and impact programs, such as our Gold Fellows program, where we are training young entrepreneurs from Bosnia and now Serbia. So if you're interested, please do check out our website and social media for more details. And our briefings are usually available after on our YouTube channel as well. So before I introduce our panelists, just a quick caveat. There are a lot of conversations that are happening about Ukraine and its reconstruction, even as this brutal war grinds on. And by necessity, there are many players in footing the upwards of $500 billion bill for reconstruction and putting it into action. Today, we have several perspectives, but I just want to point out that we're missing those of civil society, those of European partners, and the private sector. So we will largely be focused today on the diplomatic perspective from the United States, as well as the economic one from Ukraine, with a panel of really top experts. So I hope that this is only the first of such conversations that we have about Ukraine and its future. So I am really pleased to welcome today our panelists. First, we have Oleksandra Betliy, and she is the leading research fellow and project coordinator at the Institute for Economic Research and Policy Consulting in Kyiv, I believe, where she focuses on fiscal policy and tax forecasting, as well as social sector issues. We also have Ambassador William Courtney, who has had a multi-decade career as a diplomat, where he served as ambassador to Kazakhstan, Georgia, and the US-Soviet Bilateral Consultative Commission to implement the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. He has served in top positions in the NSC and White House on Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia as well. So very distinguished career. And last but not least, we have retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who is most recently Director for Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Russia on the White House National Security Council. And he also served as the Political Military Affairs Officer for Russia for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and as an attaché at the US Embassy in Moscow. So a lot of relevant experience in our Zoom room. Welcome and thank you to everyone for participating in this conversation today. So Ambassador Courtney, I want to start with you with a foundational question. Since the start of the second invasion of Ukraine almost a year ago, the United States has sent about $48 billion in bilateral aid, spanning military aid to humanitarian aid. And a Pew poll that was taken less than 2 weeks ago shows that the share of Americans who say that the United States is providing too much support has grown from 20% in September to 26% in January. So given these trend lines, can you please give your perspective as a senior level diplomat about why we should care about Ukraine and its reconstruction? You are muted.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm honored to be the other Courtney in this session. So looking back at Franklin Roosevelt's challenge in building support for U.S. Entry into the war and supporting European allies, what we discovered from that period was that leadership is quite important. And Franklin Roosevelt did a lot of leading at that time. So the United States was better prepared than it would have been otherwise when Pearl Harbor came. Well, in the current situation, we see pretty strong leadership in the West. It's not just the United States, but also Europe. There's a widespread feeling that what Russia is doing is a direct challenge to the post-World War II security order in Europe, that it is unprovoked aggression, and that if aggression is appeased, that this could make matters worse. President Biden was quite clear on this in the State of the Union speech, where he reiterated, as he said other times, that we will stand with Ukraine as long as Ukraine wants our help. Now, of course, there are people in Congress and elsewhere who are concerned about how much money is being spent or concerned about other aspects. There was a letter by some progressive members of Congress that was released but then pulled back some months ago. And then some members of the House side, on the more conservative side, have also expressed concern. But thus far, we see pretty strong bipartisan support, even more so in the Senate than in the House. And we see no signs of Ukraine fatigue. Ukraine has been doing relatively well. The battlefield momentum has been strong, although recently has been stabilized a bit. And we see the same thing in Europe. We see the British, the French, the Germans, all bending over backwards to try to help. The United States is doing the most, but the Europeans are doing a lot. President Zelensky was just there on a thank you tour, and also a tour to encourage provision of combat aircraft. And of course, Zelensky was here, spoke to a joint session of Congress, also thanking the United States and seeking more arms. So far, this is going really better than anyone could have expected.
All right, thank you. That is encouraging to hear. So turning to you, Oleksandra, estimates of the cost of reconstruction are upwards of $500 billion, including a $750 billion proposal from Ukraine. Can you break that number down for us? What are some of the categories of need, and what is the vision that Ukraine has for how this money could be spent?
Hi, actually, we indeed have several numbers for recovery needs and financing, and they are just different, and they're calculated according to different methodologies. And one is, for example, the World Bank assessment, which was made in September, but it was as of June 2022. And this assessment is that recovery needs financing at $349 billion. And this basically includes the biggest categories which need financing are housing, because many houses were destroyed by Russian missiles and drones. Then these are roads and other infrastructure. Large financing is needed for land decontamination, because we have a huge problem of mines put in our land by Russians on the north and the east and south of the country. And especially on the south, we have to take into account that this is agricultural land and we really need it for harvesting. And so these are kind of the biggest categories. And this amount of money, which was assessed, is much higher now, just because starting October, Russians bombed much more heavily as civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and therefore currently the World Bank is working on a new assessment, and I think it will be closer to 500 or even more or billions. And this is really kind of the money which we need for reconstruction of what was destroyed. When we talk about money like this 750 billion, which was put in the National Recovery Plan by the government, which was presented in Lugano in June 2022, then this is not only kind of reconstruction, but also this is modernization of the country. And this includes financing of projects which are needed for sustainable economic development of the country, according to the principles of build back better. So we have to rebuild something which is better than it was before, because I mean, like, we don't need all the housing, and we need energy efficient housing, and ecological standards would be there. We need new like factories, not the old ones which were destroyed by Russians, etc. And this will need more financing. But here I would like to say that we are not talking about really only kind of official grants or official lending. We understand clearly, and this is perceived by everybody, that we talk about FDIs as well. And in order foreign direct investments come to Ukraine, we will have to do homework with the reforms, and we are already doing this. And therefore, it's not only official financing. And one more amount which is named and recalled recently, like really fast, is 17 billion euros. This is the amount for emergency financing. So it's kind of really emergent projects which are needed, like to rebuild some housing and some roads, which will need for the country to live now, to keep going now.
Okay, thank you. That was a very helpful breakdown. Alexander, turning to you, of the many articles and reports about reconstruction for Ukraine, a frequent phrase that I am hearing is after the war and when fighting subsides. However, as you know, fighting is ongoing, and Russia is really a master at creating these areas of long-term destabilization. So in short, when the war ends or fighting subsides seems to be a rather vague and perhaps unreachable milestone. So with your military and policy background, how do you see the timing on Ukraine's reconstruction, and how do you break down the very comprehensive list of recommendations that you wrote about in your foreign affairs to account for ongoing conflict?
Sure. So let me start by saying that reconstruction should start now. What I mean by that is that there is a planning phase and a preparation phase. It might amount to 1, 2, 3% of the entire investment that countries or industries might make. And they could do that now in the preparatory phase to set conditions for wholesale construction at a point in the future, 12 months down the road or so. But it should also be a phased reconstruction. It doesn't have to occur. It's not going to be able to really occur on the front lines because those are static, maybe even, you know, a buffer to those front lines. But other areas, other regions like Chernihiv is unlikely to be threatened the same way. Devastated city, suburbs around Kyiv, those are out of the fight. What Russia does have to offer in this sphere is a kind of like a pocket veto by threatening investments and making, you know, kind of investors question whether they should be putting resources in now. And they'll do that by going after targets that are being rebuilt. I think, therefore, you need both. You need a way to warn off Russia, indicating that it would pay for damage to reconstruction. So let's say a foreign government donates resources, then all those frozen assets that are kind of in European capitals in the US would be tapped to you know, repair and replace. So it's not a kind of a perpetual cycle of rebuild and Russia destroying it and warning off investments. I think, frankly, the way I think about this in the article I wrote, I thought about 3 kind of pillars of funding. One is grants, block grants, loans, heavily weighted towards grants. I start thinking about this in terms of you know, what the EU has transferred to developing economies like Poland over the course of a decade or more out of conflict, and the amounts are kind of startling, 181 billion. So when you start to think about grants of those kinds, you know, the EU contributing tens of billions, you know, eventually even hundreds of billions, as not as loans, but as grants, starts to make a little bit more sense. I start to think about asset forfeitures and ongoing discussion. I know the US Congress is thinking about this carefully. There's a lot of resistance from the executive branch about upsetting the apple cart, breaking norms on you know, sovereign assets. But I think we're getting there, and we're likely to move in that direction. So it'd be seeding public-private partnerships like the Western NIS, or building new public-private partnerships for reconstruction and investment. So if you think about grants and loans that might go to national reconstruction projects, small and medium projects could be funded through these public-private partnerships. And then the last thing, I think, is setting conditions for private equity investments. And I think sophisticated actors are already looking at private equity investments. Ukraine's captured the imagination of the democratic world, and therefore people are kind of itching to find a way, almost find an excuse to justify investments. I think there are folks that are looking at already investing in planning and development phase in preparation for the future. Those would be the kind of the prime movers when reconstruction starts in earnest. They'll have the relationships on the ground. But it's also the onus is on the EU and the US to undergird those kinds of investments with things like the Development Finance Corporation, which has the mandate to do national security investments, but not for reconstruction, and not on the scale that we're looking at in terms of Ukraine. In this kind of situation, you'd want the Development Finance Corporation to take a careful look at their requirements for equity investments. So, you know, some of that seed capital, and then you'd want to also expand the aperture on insurance. I think that's probably a good snapshot there. I want to make a quick comment on the question you asked Ambassador Courtney about why should we care, and is it worth the cost? For those 48 billion that you mentioned earlier, we've basically defanged to a certain extent the conventional capability of one of our principal adversaries, an adversary that has demonstrated a willingness to use military means. For a fifth of the defense budget for a year, Russia is not a conventional threat to NATO for a decade or more. It's going to take it a huge amount of time to rebuild. And then this kind of the slippage in support, there's still a pretty amazing amount of support in the US population for Ukraine. But we do have kind of a horseshoe of pretty far left and far right factions that are kind of arraying to a isolationist kind of retrenching type of policy, which is, you know, this bumper sticker of ending forever wars. This is not one of those scenarios. We're not involved in this war. We're supporting a sovereign state and an ally. And also, we should recognize that there are some other. I mean, the fact is that, you know, you have organizations like the Koch network that's putting $1 million to support a group called Concerned Veterans for America, so they could campaign against it. And that builds on the media landscape, of kind of the right media landscape that's anti-Ukraine, pro-Russian to a certain extent, a lot of it catering to the former president of the United States that had a deep animus for Ukraine. So I just wanted to add a little bit of context there. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for breaking that down and putting some of those numbers in context. Ambassador Courtney, turning to you, there are many institutions and stakeholders who have an interest in Ukraine's reconstruction. Can you walk us through some of the major players? Who are they? And talk about some of the diplomatic coordination that really needs to happen to ensure that a strategic vision does not become the victim of a lack of coordination, of sort of having too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. And just to add on to that, what role do you see the US playing? You're muted.
There, okay, thank you. First, let me say I agree with Alex's point. If we look back to the Marshall Plan after World War II, it teaches us a few lessons. And the Marshall Plan was widely regarded, and has been widely regarded, as a major success for the West of the United States. In that situation, there was a U.S. organization set up, and it worked with the European organization. Now, there were 16 European countries that benefited, and so we dealt with those countries, but there was also a Central European organization. In that situation, the amount of communication was really quite considerable between the United States and Europe, and it worked quite well. Now it's kind of the opposite situation, where we have a lot of countries that are donors and one country that's the recipient. So if we look back to Marshall Plan, I think we would want to have some kind of a central organization of Europe, the United States would participate in. And it could be G7 led, it could be EU led, or there could be some other framework. And of course, let's not forget Japan and some of our other allies. So we would want to have some coordination, but we would not want it to be top down. In the Marshall Plan, we asked the Europeans to tell us what were their priorities for reconstruction, and they did. And the Marshall Plan had a more narrow scope. It was to restart the European economy. So the focus wasn't on building housing, for example, or schools. It was to get the economy going again so that the Europeans themselves could afford to do the rest of the reconstruction. In this case, there's been more conversation about a much larger scope. In today's dollars, the Marshall Plan is about $160 billion. But yet discussions about the amount of damage being done to Ukraine run up as high as $1 trillion. So there will have to be some triage, some deciding on priorities, what would be done. And that would best be done through a coordinated mechanism between the Europeans, the United States, other donors, and Ukraine. And of course, within Ukraine, hopefully implementation will be decentralized across all the oblast or regions of Ukraine and not have a single top-down implementing organization. A single coordinating mechanism makes a lot of sense, so strategic planning, but implementation should be decentralized as much as possible.
All right, thank you very much. I have some good follow-up questions to that, which I will get to in the Q&A because I see some of them coming in the Q&A box. So I think that there's more we can dig into there in a little bit once we get to the Q&A portion. Oleksandra, turning to you. Recently, President Zelensky fired several government officials for corruption. Since 2012, Ukraine's corruption perception index, as measured by Transparency International, has improved to 26 to 33 on a scale of 0 to 100. So for the audience, just to put this in perspective, 0 is highly corrupt, 100 is very clean. The United States comes in at 69. Denmark, which is top ranking, comes in at 90. So Ukraine improved from 26 to 33. So with so much money flowing into the country, what measures is the government taking to ensure that funds reach their end goal without inadvertently corroding the gains that Ukraine has made against corruption?
Before coming to the current times, reconstruction, I will make one statement and then, just several examples from the history of Ukraine. So the statement is that, in fact, corruption perception is different from corruption incidents. And there are surveys when people are asked and businesses are asked about corruption incidents, and then we don't see there that corruption is really huge in Ukraine as compared to many other countries. And this should be taken into account. Also, when we ask a business, what are the impediments for business development? And usually IRR, where I work, conducts such survey regularly, and we ask this question, then corruption is not even in the top 10 or even it's lower. So not big share of businesses considers corruption as an impediment to business. However, the corruption is really overtalked in Ukraine, and this is one of the results that our civil society is really good watchdog, and we have strong media which do lots of investigation, and we do not tolerate corruption. And this should be taken into account. Sometimes we are successful in fact, sometimes we talk about this and then some decisions are made. And actually between 2015 and 2022, many decisions by the government were taken into in a way to make reforms which would prevent corruption. One of them was openness of the data. And in 2015, the government opened the web portal, which is called Spending.gov.ua. And this is a portal where you see almost in real time all transactions of the government and the local governments, which are made at the expense of government money through state treasury. Kind of all transactions, who was receiving the payment, why it was done, what is the background, and we do see this. And basically this is in fact a good material for media investigators and for civil society to be watchdogs. Even during the war, most of this information is still open. Some transactions which are considered as those that relate to defense and the security items are closed, but all others are open, and we still can monitor this, and we can still see the numbers and transactions. Another very important reform, which also allows us to monitor the government and control how the money are spent, is ProZorro. It's electronic public procurement system, and ProZorro in fact means is translated as transparency. So it's really a transparent system which received Gold Award for its efficiency. And in fact, there we also see all contracts, all announcements, etc. Again, during the war, full-scale invasion, currently we don't see all acts there. Some are closed just again to the security reasons. But still many are published there. And recently, for example, I looked at the tenders of my locality where I live, and in order to see what they were buying and who won the tender. So it's really open information. And again, that's why basically we have lots of investigations, because we have lots of data and we can use it and see this. There were also other reforms. In 2018, in fact, the IR conducted the assessment which showed that these reforms that were aimed partially or directly, indirectly, prevention of corruption, saved the government 6% of GDP. So I think it's a lot. And these reforms are still with us. And besides, after that, the full-scale anti-corruption infrastructure is put in place. This actually is the infrastructure which was advocated and pushed for by European Union and by the IMF and other countries. And we have now Anti-Corruption Bureau, we have Anti-Corruption Court, Prosecutor Office, and this and result of their work is these dismissals that you were talking about like recently. So basically it means that all this kind of infrastructure, anti-corruption and prevention is already in place. And I think it will help also during the kind of reconstruction financing process. And luckily, the government also understands that we really need a trust now. And my formula, and not only mine, formula for the trust is that transparency, efficiency, and accountability. And in fact, we follow this. And the government currently, together with the civil society, which is united under the coalition RISE, are working on the creation of electronic system for recovery management. This will be a big comprehensive IT platform where you can see everything which relates to reconstruction and recovery from the initial stage of the project development to financing and to implementation. This project will be a kind of platform is to be started creating already in spring this year. And I really think that this transparency, which will provide trust by donors and also private investors, because private investors are really welcome to Ukraine. And I support the point that they will need still insurance. And currently the Ministry of Economy works with MIGA and other insurance companies on projects to insure war risks for companies which will come to Ukraine in this difficult time. And also what I would like to mention that still, for example, when we talk about grants that United States provide to Ukraine, these grants are earmarked primarily to social payments, for example, and wages. And there is a clear oversight there. There is a clear regular audit of these amounts, and the government reports on each dollar spent for these items. There is a clear reporting and oversight, and I don't think that any kind of fraud is possible there, just because United States really care about how money is spent. And last but not least, but I think it's very essential, we want to become a member of European Union. And last year we have received a status of candidate of the European Union member, and therefore we will have, and we already have, a homework to do. And one of the tasks, for example, is the judicial reform, which will really be important and essential for Ukraine to ensure property rights protection, that business is protected here, and that everything works smoothly and fine. Therefore, I think we have huge homework, and I think that the government and civil society in Ukraine is not only watchdogs, but also so-called sled dogs, kind of working together now. I mean, like, in order to ensure that we do everything properly, just because we will need money for recovery for longer time, not for only this year or next year.
Thank you very much. It's very encouraging to hear. I'm going to get to my last question before I turn to the Q&A. So Alexander, for you wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs, another one, entitled "Stop Tiptoeing Around Russia," in which you argue that by trying to preserve a relationship with Moscow, Washington has inadvertently been shortchanging US national security and the security of Russia's neighbors. Do you see this paradigm extending to the US approach to Ukraine's reconstruction?
It certainly extends to the way that US conducts its policy towards Ukraine at the moment. That article, that long article, was a distillation of my doctoral dissertation, which I managed to complete in December, and kind of validate what were somewhat earlier conclusions. The bottom line is that we tend to, as the preeminent power, enjoy relations with other great powers, even if they're not necessarily partners on the international stage. And we defer, and oftentimes, I think, in our relationships to what amounts to regional hegemony. We do this explicitly and implicitly. I think the implicit factors are sometimes a little bit more, kind of more difficult to dispense with. It's the fact that Russia in its backyard has some sort of authority and has a legitimate national security interest or security interest, and therefore has a voice over the affairs in the former republics of the Soviet Union. That extends to today, and the fact that we keep talking about this. This is the whole kind of dialogue from what I would refer to as the appeasement bloc, that Russia has legitimate concerns about this war in Ukraine, and that it needs to potentially be, it's Russia that needs to be given off-ramps and face-saving measures, as opposed to Ukraine that has the right to defend itself and liberate its occupied territory and free, its population from really kind of a barbarous, oppressive regime that Russia is as it occupies Ukraine. This is a long-standing issue. It's what plays out with regards to our deep incrementalism with military support to Ukraine. It's going to expand to, or continue to affect, economic reconstruction, because this whole idea of whether we actually compel Russia as a member of the international system, whether it likes it or not, to pay for the damages it's caused in Ukraine. And I think there's going to be we see it play out in this whole discussion about state sponsor of terrorism designations, that Russia would ultimately be isolated, and you could pursue legal actions. American litigants could pursue legal actions against Russian state assets and things of that nature. We're quite differential to Russia, even to this day. And I think the fact is that, Russia, really the only thing that it has to speak for itself is it is the largest country by territory. It's stretched across 11 time zones, 140 million people. That might speak to some sort of unique status, but it's really not even that kind of accounts for the way we defer to Russia. It's one tool that it has in its toolbox, which is a massive nuclear arsenal. If it weren't for this one tool, this artifact of the Soviet Union, we would basically not pay Russia the same kind of mind. There's an interesting debate. It's probably not going to go anywhere, I mean, honestly, but there's a debate about Russia's status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Is it the true inheritor of the Soviet Union seat? There was no formal process for that transfer. It was kind of a and I think Ambassador Courtney might have he was witness to some of these deliberations, so he might have some more clarity on this. But there's a huge. This just goes to the point that we're quite differential towards Russia, and eventually we need to recognize that Russia in its current form, under the Putin regime and probably in subsequent regimes for the next decade or two, is going to be closer to a North Korea than it is going to be to another kind of potential partner, a rehabilitated partner, and we probably need to adapt our diplomacy to reflect that kind of situation.
All right, thank you. I'm going to turn to the Q&A box and continue along that line of thinking. But just to the audience, if you have any questions and you would like to ask them, please put them in the Q&A box. So Alexander, I just want to stick on this point for a little bit, because we have a question in the Q&A box that references your reference to using frozen assets to pay for the damage. And the questioner writes, however, it's supposed that harsh reparations can lead to the repeating history of, and they're referencing Nazi Germany after World War I. So the question is how to prevent such a scenario and get enough financial compensation from Russia, and how to calculate the optimal size of reparations.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The question itself kind of appeals to me as a historian, and a recognition that the reparations and the Treaty of Versailles was a major contributing factor to the rise of radicalism in Nazi Germany. What kind of strikes me right now is that Russia is pretty darn radical already. It's in a lot of ways it's already kind of a fascist regime. I'm not sure how much further it can go, really. The only thing that it has left in its arsenal, especially after its conventional capabilities have been neutered, is nuclear, and it's probably going to do that regardless of what kind of. I think it's going to. We sometimes overassess the influence that foreign influences, U.S. power, NATO has on the internal dynamics of Russia. Those kind of developed themselves internally, organically, versus the pressure that NATO enlargement or kind of any actions that NATO took independently. Right now, the kind of main factor in Russia's development and potential radicalization is the ultimate defeat on the battlefields in Ukraine, which are going to unfold over the course of the next year, hopefully not more, but in a year or two. And I think those things are something that we need to be very, very mindful of. Hedge against the more radical regimes, make sure we're prepared. There is no interest on the part of the Russians to tangle with NATO based on the fact that they've not preserved any conventional capability, and they understand that nuclear escalation is mutually assured destruction. So they're not suicidal. Even radical regimes are not going to are deterred. They're not suicidal. There's no kind of real precedence for that kind of regime that's interested in kind of terminating themselves. Nazi Germany was aggressive because it believed it could secure territory, achieve its military aims, its political aims through military force. Russia doesn't have any illusions about that. They're kind of trying to hang on to whatever gains they have in Ukraine. So I think the question about, if we went through that whole logic string, the question about how far we should go with regards to reparation, they should be costly to deter other regimes from considering military force to achieve their political aims. They should be sufficient to help rebuild Ukraine. And frankly, they should be, there should probably be, we should assume a little bit of risk on the part that we need to do more to help rebuild Ukraine and some punitive actions against Russia, and just be mindful of the fact that if we go too far, it could be destabilizing. So that's going to be that's a policymaker's difficult challenge. But I have a feeling that we could thread that one, and I fear that we're going to do not enough rather than too much, frankly, in that regard, because of our deference to Russia.
Right. Interesting. Thank you very much. An interesting question. Alexandra, sorry, I'm working my way backwards now. I'm going in reverse order. Picking up on what Ambassador Courtney had said about, the decentralization of projects, I'd be curious to hear from you. We have a question in the Q&A box about who decides and prioritizes the project. So if you're taking this decentralized method, if you have say some of the country that is stable and able to be reconstructed, and some of it that might be in conflict for a while longer. How does Kyiv decide which projects move forward?
There are several kind of parts of this question. First, I would like to say that decentralization reform was one of the successes of Ukraine after 2015. We have built really kind of capable the local governments, and therefore currently local governments have already started playing a big role in the reconstruction, taking into account that there is the central government has huge problems with, huge challenges on the defense issues, security issues, and for example sometimes lack of money. Then local governments play a role also for emergency reconstruction. They look for funds somewhere else, they work with the European Union countries and others in order to start already kind of reconstruction, at least like hospitals, education establishments on the liberated areas. Also, one of the challenges that we faced is this electricity outages because Russia heavily destroyed our energy infrastructure. And therefore, local governments are now very active in getting and receiving and purchasing electricity generators, for example, and working with abroad. This is kind of real emergency issues. When we talk about long-term reconstruction, then the issue of prioritization is currently highly debated in Ukraine. It's not yet decided. The government has created the Agency for Reconstruction under the Ministry of Infrastructure. And this will be an agency which will be responsible for making processes smoothly and efficient, etc. They will be responsible for also talking with the international donors for financing for reconstruction. There will be, and currently the methodology for prioritization of the project is discussed. However, when we talk about, again, this electronic system of recovery management, there is an idea that local governments will be able to put their projects, and therefore donors will be able to pick up the project on the local level. And there are different approaches under the discussion, but everybody basically, I mean, like civil society especially pushes now that decentralization should be kept in mind, and local governments should play a major role there. And I think that we will basically have this, in fact, just because, I mean, like they know better the priorities and they know better what is needed there.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Courtney, turning to you, we have a question. I know we talked about the coordination, but we do have a question from someone who's asking, can you address the issue of international oversight and coordination of Ukraine's reconstruction, given the scope and the need to have as many contributors as possible and an extensive range of expertise? Do you think that the UN and its specialized agencies might be an appropriate body for the oversight and coordination?
The United Nations can play valuable roles in many areas, but in this area, the United Nations is not an experienced provider of assistance in a broad range of areas. More likely, the EU, the US, the United Kingdom, Japan will try to find a way to coordinate and involve people who are professionals at providing assistance. I think the willingness of donor countries to give money to will be higher if they have a stake in the coordination of assistance, whereas some countries may not be so willing to provide so much money to the United Nations.
Great, thank you very much. Alexander, we have an interesting question here. We talk a lot about Washington and what Washington can do. This question is, how can the local US state administrations be engaged and assist Ukraine in rebuilding its economy after the war?
That is an interesting question. What you find is the way donors are looking to contribute to reconstruction Ukraine is that they've kind of focused in on regions. Like the French have focused in on Chernihiv. That's kind of one example. I think you're likely to find kind of similar. I'm sorry. So what you're likely to find is similar kind of almost like a regional focus from various states. I think there's something also to be said about sister city programs. Those wouldn't be just necessarily because cities typically don't have the resources to kind of support large scale reconstruction. But what they might do is they might add a flavor of private sector investments. Think about a place like Chicago, one of the largest cities in the United States, a huge economic engine in the United States, that's a sister city to Kyiv that undertakes, maybe some infrastructure investments, but mainly looks to channel some of the economic resources and some of the kind of the corporate entities to focus in on reconstruction in Kyiv or more broadly. So I think there's something to be said about kind of a regionally oriented reconstruction. I fear one of the things I'd want to ensure is not that you don't end up with a situation of haves and have-nots, that you have a different kind of levels of investment from different partners. You do need, as Ambassador Courtney pointed out, you need some sort of kind of hub for at least coordinating all of these resources coming into Ukraine. I think it's going to have to be a deep partnership between what Ukraine wants and what the donor community is offering. That's going to have to go through this coordinating body. And frankly, there's going to have to be a bit of a learning curve. This is going to unfold in phases where, maybe there's a heavier involvement from the donor community, with kind of board seats or something like that early on, and then it kind of the weight shifts to Ukraine as they prove to be good stewards of the resources. And I think that would happen, but it would have to happen over time. Give people confidence that their resources are being, that their Ukrainians are being good stewards of their resources.
Alexandra, interesting question here. that is, some of the women we speak with on the ground, this is the questioner stating this, are worried about the structures and requirements of some of the international grants, which create additional barriers for small grassroots groups to get the necessary funding. Building on this idea of decentralization, how can we remove the barriers for women leaders on a local level to get the financing they need for small scale projects? So I'd love just to get your perspective in Ukraine about what you're hearing on this topic. And then, Ambassador Courtney or Alexander, if you'd like to chime in on what the international community can do in terms of those barriers, that would be great.
To be honest, I'm not really sure about what kind of barriers, the question is about, just because when we talk about, especially when we talk about women and men, most projects are kind of gender balanced, really take into account the gender. So it's about this. Then when we talk about different communities, I have already, really know already different practices. When support was received by big towns and cities, and when support was received by, grants were really received by really small villages. So I'm not really sure what it meant here. If the person who asked the question could elaborate more, what is the kind of barriers under this question? Because currently I really don't see, any problems with the women leaders, to be honest. And especially taking into account that mostly men are now fighting on the front line, then we cannot avoid that women are becoming more leaders. And I haven't seen any really, if there is kind of explanation for the person, I would really appreciate it, because I haven't seen anything like this.
I think I understand the question. It's kind of it's a patriarchal society, although frankly women have a very powerful voice. They're educators, they're ministers. There are a number of very senior women leaders, I guess, but I think fundamentally it's a question about gender bias and access for women to resources. I think this is probably something to be mindful of, and that there are probably there's no easy solution. I wonder if the EU in its accession program kind of lays out some parameters that makes kind of distribution of resources a little bit more equitable. I would imagine that there's probably something of that nature. That's it's part of the way the EU operates. But I also wouldn't overstate it, because in fact, I think the Ukrainian society is relatively progressive, more so than people tend to imagine. And on that basis, there are some hurdles, but they're not insurmountable.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Courtney, if you can answer this one, or if anyone wants to chime in, we have a question about how secure are the nuclear facilities? Do you have any insight into that, and what's being done, and sort of what's being coordinated from IAEA or other agencies?
So Ukraine has cooperated closely with the International Atomic Energy Agency over the years in nuclear reactor safety and the various security mechanisms that are required. After the Chernobyl explosion in 1986, there was a lot of concern in the former Soviet space and in Europe as well, because Europe can receive, as it did in Chernobyl, some of the fallout from tragic accidents. So Ukrainians have cooperated very closely. I believe Ukraine has 4 large nuclear power facilities, but one of those is under Russian control now in Zaporizhia. It is a quite large facility. The Russians appear to have allowed IAEA officials to inspect the facilities. And of course, there's been a risk of firing guns around that area. But those reactors have pressure containment vessels, which the kind of reactor that blew up in Chernobyl did not have those vessels. So in general, the plants in Ukraine are pretty safe. But of course, if there were an outbreak of fighting around Zaporizhzhia or one of the other plants, that could increase vulnerability.
All right, thank you. Question for the historians in the room. Alexander, I'm looking at you. We have someone who's asking, is there a moral obligation for the United States and the United Kingdom under the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, not only during this war, but also for reconstruction? So how does the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 play into this?
Sure, happy to answer that one. I'd zoom a little bit further back than that even. I would say that, one of the things that we have attention in our foreign policy with is between kind of realist foreign policy or realpolitik and kind of, more liberalist policy. And I'm a proponent for, I guess the latter, mainly because I understand how central our values are to our interests, and that we tend to be sometimes transactional, look the other way, like we did during, 2 decades of Putin's leadership, often, softly condemning or frankly sidestepping thorny issues with an undemocratic and anti-democratic turn in Russia, then an attack on neighbors, interference in the kind of elections back all the way into 2004, precipitating the Orange Revolution, assassinations, that emboldened Putin to go after our own elections in 2016. We did that on a transactional basis. We did it on the basis that we thought there was more to accomplish with Russia than there really was. In fact, if we were probably a little bit more mindful of our values and our, the fundamental importance of preserving the post-World War II rules-based international order, we would have probably been a little bit more consistent in both our condemnations and our support to Ukraine, hardening Ukraine to a level, this is a bit of a counterfactual, but where it didn't look as vulnerable as it did now in 2022 for Putin. Imagine we made major investments in 2005 after the Orange Revolution. We were less concerned about provoking Putin and nurtured a much more of a kind of thriving economy that had a larger industrial base for defense. So I think the fact is that this is a conclusion in mind for my dissertation, is that we probably need to be a little bit more mindful of our values and not just our interests, recognizing again that our interests, our values are central to our interests. It gives us kind of a true north, a compass heading that allows us to have more consistency. Now, that doesn't mean that we always bend our kind of to our values. There are thorny situations where we might have to compromise, but we're very, very mindful when we do so. So what does that mean for 1994 and the Budapest Accords? The U.S., I think when we signed those documents, was very, very, in a lot of ways, was forward-looking and did not want to sign up for the obligation of coming to Ukraine's defense. That's why we called them assurances, not security guarantees, where there was a consultative process or something in place. The problem is that we didn't even kind of we weren't faithful to even those kind of minimal requirements. We almost completely sidestepped this issue of the Budapest Accords. There were no consultations between the UN, UK, US, and compelling Russia to attend in a Budapest type format or something of that nature. I think we do have some obligations in recognizing that by compelling compelling Ukraine to denuclearize, to enhance US security, we in certain ways weaken their own ability to defend themselves. And then subsequently, we kind of, after they denuclearized, we stopped really paying attention to Ukraine for quite some time. And when there were opportunities to invest in Ukraine and to live up to our kind of support, we didn't do that. And that's frankly why we find ourselves in 2022 in a large-scale war between the largest country in the world and the largest country in Europe, and with the real possibilities of a spillover, because we really didn't do enough to satisfy our obligations early.
Thank you. Just trying to be mindful of time. I know we have about 5 minutes left, and I think we have a hard stop at 1. Ambassador Courtney, I wanted to turn to you with this question of and especially, from what you've seen in government over the years, how do we guarantee that the obligations made to Ukrainian reconstruction don't get withdrawn or diminished if domestic governments change dramatically?
Domestic governance in the donor countries, or
yes,
Ukraine?
yeah, the donor countries, and I think in particular the United States.
There is no guarantee. The donors will cooperate, coordinate, and the strongest guarantee, if you will, of the United States is that we have to have support from the Congress and the president, unless there's a veto, which is unusual in this circumstance. We have to have a coordinated approach across a couple branches of government to provide large-scale assistance around the world, and we do that now. I don't think there's any guarantee that political change could take place in France or Great Britain or the United States that would prevent assistance programs from going ahead. And if it is a well-coordinated approach, even if one country has to take exception to participation for a while, we have a lot of other countries involved. So this is why this should be a big tent, should be all the countries in the West and other countries as well, helping Ukraine.
Great, thank you. So this next question, it's a two-part question, and I'll turn to you, Oleksandra. You can take which part you would like, and then perhaps Alexander can take the second part. So the questioner had spent some time in Iraq, and he says that he saw two things that he would like not to see in Ukraine, in whatever Ukrainian context, how it transfers over. And the first is muscle-bound reporting requirements to avoid corruption that actually hamper projects. And the second would be a nasty insurgency, in this case by ethnic Russians, perhaps undermining or sabotaging critical reconstruction projects. And so the questions are, so they're twofold, you can take your pick. Are there potential challenges to reconstruction, in particular the reporting requirements, which Ukraine might not have a lot to say, might not have a lot of say on in the end result, but at least perhaps in the formation of them, to make sure that projects aren't hampered by onerous reporting. And the second question is, are the potential challenges, or is the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine likely to declare a guerrilla war against Ukraine?
Yeah, difficult question. I would think that the answer to the first one is still transparency. I mean, like, if we make the process as transparent as possible, if we make all information as transparent as possible, then there will be less need for really complex audits or checks and inspections, etc. And this was shown by already our experience in the past. And I think this is kind of what we really need to ensure. And when I talk we, I mean everybody in Ukraine. I mean, like central government, local governments, and civil society. We all basically should push for this transparency and for this, which will ensure the trust of donors, which will not then require any additional inspection and checks. Because really there is a problem of that the process will be slowed down by some additional inspections, etc. One of the ideas that is already also discussed is that there will be kind of model plans made, for example, for the construction of hospitals or education establishments. So therefore, there will be kind of check and balances. I mean, like whether it is expensive or not expensive to rebuild or build a new hospital and education facility. And this is really essential to take into account that there are also, I mean, like always costs to some kind of additional bureaucracy, and we really need to avoid it just because we need faster process of going. And one of the reasons for that is, for example, currently one of the priorities defined by the president is rebuilding of housing, and this is explained by the fact that many Ukrainians fled the country. So I mean, like they moved to, for example, the European Union, and we have to return them home, and they need housing for this. And we really need to return them home because for recovery we need people. And human capital is really essential for recovery in Ukraine, and we really want to return our people to Ukraine, as many as possible, to have this recovery for somebody. So we need, I mean, like people to benefit from recovery. And then we need people who will work in new sustainable economy of Ukraine. And for Russian minority, I don't think that like there will be sabotage. What I'm afraid is that sabotage could be from people, like who just, like as we had before, for example, for some cases, like when people have low capacities or they don't know how to do things. So like this will be kind of sabotage as well there. And therefore, I think that the technical assistance will be really needed into increase of capacity of local governments, of regional civil society. When we talk about decentralization, then we need kind of high support for capacities in local level for development of civil society as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. On that note, we did go just slightly over time. I'm sorry we had to lose Ambassador Courtney, who had to run to another meeting. So we didn't get to hear my thanks to you all for a really excellent discussion. Thank you for the work that you both are doing and looking at reconstruction from a very holistic point of view. And thank you to the audience for great questions. Do we have any announcements, Brian? Yes, we do. Just really quickly, our next briefing is in person in New York. So if you're in New York and you'd like to attend and you're not yet a member, please reach out. You can get more information about this. It will be about trends to look for in a post-pandemic world with Dr. Maha Aziz. So we're looking forward to that. And again, we're a nonprofit. If you want to keep these briefings free and open to all, we appreciate any support you can give. So with that, Oleksandra, Alexander, thank you very much, Ambassador Courtney. Really appreciate the discussion today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, bye.
Bye-bye.